The vast steppes of Central Asia witnessed one of history's most consequential population movements during the 3rd millennium BCE, as Indo-European speaking peoples began their gradual dispersal across Eurasia. Among these migrating groups, the ancestors of the Hittites embarked on a westward journey that would ultimately lead them into the rugged highlands of Anatolia, where they would establish one of the ancient world's most formidable empires. The linguistic evidence for this migration presents a fascinating puzzle that scholars have painstakingly reconstructed through comparative analysis of ancient texts and archaeological findings. Hittite belongs to the Anatolian branch of the Indo-European language family, distinguished by several archaic features that set it apart from other Indo-European languages. The language preserves the laryngeal consonants that most other Indo-European languages had lost by the time of their earliest attestations, providing crucial evidence for the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European phonology. The discovery of Hittite texts in the early 20th century revolutionized our understanding of Indo-European linguistics, as the language displayed characteristics that linguists had theorized must have existed in the parent language, but had never been directly observed. The relationship between Hittite and its Anatolian linguistic cousins reveals the complex nature of Indo-European settlement in Asia Minor. Luwian, spoken primarily in southern and western Anatolia, shared many fundamental features with Hittite but developed distinct grammatical structures and vocabulary. Luwian texts, written in both cuneiform and the indigenous Anatolian hieroglyphic script, demonstrate that this language maintained greater continuity with pre-Indo-European Anatolian traditions than Hittite did. The geographical distribution of Luwian speakers suggests they may have arrived in Anatolia through different routes or at different times than the Hittite-speaking groups. Palaic, the third major Anatolian language, was spoken in the northern regions of Asia Minor and is known primarily through religious texts preserved in Hittite archives. The limited corpus of Palaic texts reveals a language that had undergone significant phonological changes compared to Hittite, particularly in its treatment of consonant clusters and vowel systems. The survival of Palaic primarily in religious contexts suggests that by the height of the Hittite Empire, it had become largely a liturgical language, preserved in sacred rituals and ceremonies that the Hittites had inherited from earlier Anatolian populations. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Indo-European speakers did not enter an empty landscape, but encountered sophisticated indigenous civilizations that had flourished in Anatolia for millennia. The Hattian civilization, centered in the region that would later become the Hittite heartland, had developed complex urban centers, sophisticated metallurgy, and elaborate religious practices well before the arrival of Indo-European speakers. The Hattians, whose language belongs to no known language family and may represent one of the pre-Indo-European substrates of Anatolia, had established a network of city-states connected by trade routes that stretched across the peninsula. The influence of Hattian civilization on the emerging Hittite culture cannot be overstated. The Hittites adopted wholesale many aspects of Hattian religious practice, including the worship of storm gods, earth goddesses, and protective deities associated with specific cities and natural features. The Hattian storm god, known by various names including Tarhunt, became central to Hittite royal ideology and was eventually syncretized with the Indo-European sky god to create the powerful deity Teshub, who would serve as the patron of Hittite kings throughout their history. The elaborate festival cycles that characterized Hittite religious life, with their complex rituals performed at sacred sites throughout the kingdom, drew heavily on Hattian traditions that had developed over centuries of practice. Hattian artistic traditions profoundly shaped Hittite material culture, particularly in the realm of sculpture and architectural decoration. The distinctive style of Hittite relief carving, with its emphasis on powerful, stylized figures and symbolic representations of divine and royal authority, evolved directly from Hattian prototypes. The famous lion gates and sphinx gates that would later guard Hittite cities traced their origins to Hattian concepts of architectural symbolism and protective magic. Even the layout of Hittite cities, with their upper citadels containing royal and religious buildings, overlooking lower towns devoted to commerce and crafts, reflected urban planning principles that the Hattians had perfected over generations. The archaeological record from Kultepe, ancient Kadesh, provides unprecedented insight into the sophisticated commercial and political networks that existed in pre-Hittite Anatolia. This site, located in the heart of what would become the Hittite homeland, served as a major centre for the Assyrian merchant colonies that established trading posts throughout Anatolia during the early 2nd millennium BCE. The thousands of cuneiform tablets discovered at Kultepe reveal a complex world of international commerce, legal agreements, and political relationships that connected Anatolia to the broader Near Eastern world. The Assyrian merchants at Kadesh operated under carefully negotiated agreements with local Anatolian rulers, paying taxes and fees in exchange for trading privileges and protection. These arrangements required sophisticated legal frameworks and administrative systems that demonstrate the political maturity of pre-Hittite Anatolian societies. The tablets record transactions involving copper, silver, gold, and textiles, revealing trade networks that extended from the Black Sea to Mesopotamia and from the Aegean to the Iranian plateau. The presence of Assyrian merchants also introduced new technologies, writing systems, and administrative practices that would later be adopted and adapted by the Hittites. The political organization revealed by the Kadesh archives shows a landscape of competing city-states and regional kingdoms, each controlling specific territories and trade routes. Local rulers, known by various titles including Rubaum and Isiakum, maintained courts, armies, and administrative bureaucracies that rivaled those of contemporary Mesopotamian cities. The relationships between these rulers involved complex networks of alliance, rivalry, and subordination that created a dynamic political environment in which ambitious leaders could expand their influence through military conquest, diplomatic marriage, or commercial advantage. The transition from this fragmented political landscape to the centralized monarchy that would characterize the Hittite Empire represents one of the most significant political developments in ancient Anatolian history. The process began with the gradual consolidation of power by local rulers who proved capable of extending their authority beyond their immediate city-states. These early centralizers faced the challenge of integrating diverse populations, each with their own languages, customs, and political traditions, into coherent political units. The role of local rulers in this consolidation process varied considerably depending on their geographical location, economic resources, and political acumen. Some chose to resist the expansion of centralizing powers, leading to prolonged conflicts that devastated entire regions. Others recognized the advantages of voluntary submission, particularly when faced with external threats or economic pressures that exceeded their capacity to respond independently. The most successful of these early consolidators proved adept at balancing coercion with accommodation, using military force when necessary while respecting local traditions and power structures when possible. The gradual consolidation of power in the Hittite heartland involved the systematic elimination of rival power centers and the establishment of new administrative structures that could effectively govern expanded territories. This process required not only military success, but also the development of ideological justifications for centralized rule that could appeal to diverse populations. The emerging Hittite monarchy drew on both Indo-European traditions of warrior kingship and Hattian concepts of divine sanction to create a new form of royal authority that transcended local loyalties. The integration of conquered territories into the expanding Hittite state involved complex negotiations between central authority and local autonomy. Local elites who submitted to Hittite rule often retained significant power within their traditional spheres of influence, provided they acknowledged the supremacy of the Hittite king and contributed to the military and economic needs of the growing state. This system of indirect rule allowed the Hittites to expand rapidly, while avoiding the administrative burden of directly governing every aspect of their subjects' lives. The economic foundations of this early consolidation rested on the control of strategic resources and trade routes that had made Anatolia attractive to foreign merchants and local rulers alike. The region's rich mineral deposits, particularly copper and silver, provided the wealth necessary to support professional armies and administrative bureaucracies. The control of mountain passes and river valleys allowed emerging Hittite rulers to tax trade and regulate the movement of goods and people across their territories. The development of military technology and tactics played a crucial role in enabling successful consolidation efforts. The introduction of horse-drawn chariots, probably learned from contact with peoples to the east, gave Hittite armies significant advantages over opponents who relied on traditional infantry formations. The adoption of new siege techniques and the systematic use of iron weapons, once the technology became available, further enhanced Hittite military capabilities and made resistance to their expansion increasingly futile. The religious dimension of political consolidation cannot be overlooked in understanding this transformation. The Hittite kings developed elaborate ceremonies and festivals that demonstrated their divine favour and their role as intermediaries between the gods and their subjects. These religious observances served multiple purposes. They legitimized royal authority, integrated diverse populations through shared ritual experiences, and created networks of religious sites that reinforced political control throughout the kingdom. The administrative innovations that accompanied political consolidation laid the groundwork for the sophisticated governmental systems that would characterize the mature Hittite Empire. The development of written records, legal codes, and standardized procedures for taxation and military service created the institutional framework necessary for governing large, diverse territories. The training of scribes, judges, and administrators created a professional class whose loyalty to the central government transcended local and ethnic affiliations. The establishment of centralized administrative systems created the foundation upon which Hattusa II would build his revolutionary transformation of Hittite governance and territorial control. Around 1650 BCE, this ambitious ruler made the momentous decision to relocate his capital from the traditional center of Kusara to the strategically superior site of Hattusa, a move that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Hittite civilization and establish the geographical heart of what would become one of the ancient world's most enduring empires. The selection of Hattusa as the new capital demonstrated Hattusa II's sophisticated understanding of military strategy and political symbolism. The site occupied a commanding position on a rocky outcrop that rose dramatically from the surrounding Anatolian plateau, providing natural defensive advantages that would prove crucial during the turbulent centuries ahead. The location controlled several important trade routes that connected the Black Sea coast with central Anatolia and provided access to the rich agricultural lands of the Halys River Valley. The decision to establish the capital at this particular site also carried profound symbolic significance, as Hattusa had previously served as the centre of Hattian power, and its occupation by the Hittite king represented the definitive triumph of Indo-European rule over the indigenous population. The massive fortification systems that Hattusa thus initiated at Hattusa represented the most ambitious construction project undertaken in Anatolia up to that time. The defensive walls, built from enormous blocks of local limestone, stretched for over 6 kilometers around the city and incorporated sophisticated engineering techniques that reflected both Hittite military expertise and their ability to mobilize vast quantities of labor and resources. The walls rose to heights of over 8 meters in many sections and featured projecting towers that allowed defenders to direct flanking fire against attackers. The construction required the quarrying and transport of thousands of tons of stone, a logistical achievement that demonstrated the organizational capabilities of the early Hittite state. The royal citadel, known as Buyukale, occupied the highest point of the site and served as both the administrative center of the kingdom and the symbolic representation of royal power. The complex included the king's palace, administrative buildings, archives, and religious structures arranged around a series of courtyards that could accommodate the elaborate ceremonies that legitimized Hittite rule. The palace itself featured thick walls, narrow windows, and multiple defensive gates that could be sealed in times of crisis. The throne room, where the king received foreign ambassadors and conducted state business, was decorated with relief carvings that depicted the ruler's divine sanction and military victories. The water supply system developed for Hattusa showcased the engineering sophistication of early Hittite civilization. The city's planners constructed an elaborate network of channels, cisterns, and reservoirs that collected rainwater and diverted streams from the surrounding hills. Underground tunnels carved through solid rock connected different parts of the water system and provided secure access to supplies during sieges. The largest reservoir, cut directly into the bedrock beneath the citadel, could store enough water to sustain the royal household and garrison for months during a prolonged siege. Under Hattusa II's leadership, the Hittite military machine began the systematic expansion that would transform the kingdom from a regional power into a major force in Near Eastern politics. The king's campaigns extended Hittite control southward into Syria, where his armies encountered the sophisticated urban civilizations that had developed along the trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Mediterranean coast. These military operations required careful planning and coordination, as Hittite forces had to traverse difficult mountain terrain and operate far from their logistical bases. The conquest of Al-Alach, a wealthy trading city in the Orontes River Valley, demonstrated the effectiveness of Hittite siege warfare and their ability to integrate captured territories into their expanding empire. The city's massive walls and defensive towers had previously withstood attacks by Egyptian and Mesopotamian armies, but Hittite engineers developed innovative techniques for undermining fortifications and breaching defensive walls. The capture of Al-Alach provided the Hittites with access to Mediterranean trade networks and established their presence in the strategically crucial region of northern Syria. Hattusilius' military campaigns also extended eastward into the Armenian highlands, where Hittite armies encountered the kingdoms that controlled the sources of copper and other metals essential for Bronze Age warfare. These expeditions required the development of new logistical systems capable of supporting armies operating in mountainous terrain far from the Anatolian heartland. The king's forces constructed fortified camps and supply depots that could be defended by small garrisons, while the main army continued its advance. The succession of Mursilibon to the throne around 1620 BCE marked the beginning of the most ambitious phase of early Hittite expansion. This energetic ruler inherited a kingdom that had been transformed by his predecessors' reforms and military conquests, and he possessed the resources and organizational capabilities necessary to undertake campaigns of unprecedented scope and daring. Mursili III's reign would be remembered primarily for the spectacular raid that culminated in the sack of Babylon around 1595 BCE, an achievement that demonstrated Hittite military prowess to the entire ancient world. The campaign against Babylon required months of careful preparation and the mobilization of the largest army that the Hittites had ever assembled. The logistical challenges of marching such a force across hundreds of miles of hostile territory demanded innovations in supply management, route planning, and communication systems. Hittite quartermasters established supply depots along the projected route of march and negotiated agreements with local rulers for the provision of food, fodder, and other necessities. The army included not only the traditional Hittite infantry and chariot forces, but also contingents of allied troops from throughout the expanding empire. The siege of Babylon itself represented the culmination of Hittite military development during this period. The city's massive walls and sophisticated defensive systems had protected it against numerous previous attacks, but Hittite engineers had developed new techniques for siege warfare that proved devastatingly effective. The attackers constructed massive earthworks that allowed them to bring siege engines close to the walls and use specialized troops trained in urban warfare to exploit breaches in the defenses. The fall of Babylon sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world and effectively ended the Old Babylonian period, creating a power vacuum in southern Mesopotamia that would persist for centuries. The sack of Babylon yielded enormous quantities of gold, silver, and other precious materials that financed further Hittite expansion and supported the growing complexity of royal administration. More importantly, the victory brought thousands of skilled craftsmen, scribes, and administrators to Hattusa, where they contributed their expertise to the development of Hittite civilization. Babylonian scribes introduced new writing techniques and administrative procedures that enhanced the efficiency of royal government, while craftsmen brought knowledge of metalworking, textile production, and other specialized skills. The development of Hittite law codes during this period reflected the growing sophistication of royal administration and the need to govern increasingly diverse populations. The famous Hittite laws, preserved in cuneiform tablets discovered in the royal archives at Hattusa, reveal a legal system that balanced traditional Indo-European concepts of justice with practical solutions to the problems of governing a multi-ethnic empire. The laws addressed issues ranging from property rights and commercial transactions to criminal penalties and family relationships, providing a comprehensive framework for maintaining order throughout the kingdom. The legal provisions regarding property rights demonstrate the complex social structure that had evolved within Hittite society by this period. The laws distinguished between different categories of land tenure, including royal estates, temple holdings, and private properties, each subject to different obligations and restrictions. free citizens enjoyed extensive rights to buy, sell, and inherit property, while slaves and other dependent populations were subject to various limitations on their economic activities. The legal system also recognized the special status of certain professional groups, including merchants, craftsmen, and religious personnel, who enjoyed specific privileges and protections. The judicial procedures outlined in the Hittite laws reveal a sophisticated system of courts and legal officials responsible for maintaining order and resolving disputes. Local magistrates handled routine cases involving property disputes, minor crimes, and commercial disagreements, while more serious matters were referred to regional governors or ultimately to the king himself. The legal system emphasized compensation rather than punishment for many offences, reflecting a practical approach to maintaining social stability in a diverse empire where different populations might have conflicting concepts of justice. The administrative systems that supported this legal framework required extensive bureaucratic apparatus, and the training of numerous officials capable of implementing royal policies throughout the expanding empire. The king's scribes maintained detailed records of legal proceedings, property transactions, and administrative decisions that provided precedents for future cases and ensured consistency in the application of royal law. The development of standardized procedures for taxation, military service, and other governmental functions created the institutional framework necessary for effective imperial administration. The internal succession crisis that followed Masili I's assassination around 1590 BCE exposed the fundamental weaknesses in the Hittite political system and nearly destroyed the kingdom that had been built through decades of conquest and administrative innovation. The king's death, apparently the result of a palace conspiracy, triggered a prolonged struggle between different factions of the royal family, each supported by various segments of the nobility and military leadership. The crisis revealed the extent to which Hittite political stability depended on the personal authority of individual rulers rather than institutional structures capable of managing transitions of power. The assassination itself reflected the tensions that had developed within the royal court as a result of the kingdom's rapid expansion and the distribution of power among various noble families. Masili I's military successes had created new opportunities for advancement and enrichment, but they had also generated conflicts over the allocation of conquered territories, captured wealth, and administrative positions. The king's attempts to centralize authority and reduce the independence of regional governors had alienated powerful nobles who had previously enjoyed considerable autonomy in their traditional spheres of influence. The struggle between different royal factions involved not only competition for the throne, but also fundamental disagreements about the future direction of Hittite policy. Some nobles favoured continued expansion and aggressive military campaigns that would bring additional wealth and territory under Hittite control. Others argued for consolidation of existing conquests and the development of more stable administrative systems that could ensure long-term prosperity and security. These policy debates became entangled with personal rivalries and family feuds that made compromise increasingly difficult. The temporary weakening of central authority during the succession crisis had immediate consequences for the stability of the Hittite Empire's frontier regions. Local governors who had previously maintained loyalty to the royal government began to assert greater independence, while subject populations in recently conquered territories attempted to throw off Hittite rule. The kingdom's enemies, particularly the Hurrian states to the southeast, took advantage of Hittite weakness to launch raids and recover territories that had been lost during the previous decades of expansion. The crisis also disrupted the economic systems that had supported Hittite expansion and administrative development. Trade routes that had been secured by royal military power became vulnerable to attack, while the collection of taxes and tribute from subject populations became increasingly difficult as central authority weakened. The royal treasury, which had been enriched by the spoils of conquest, faced increasing demands for military expenditures and administrative costs, while revenues declined throughout the troubled kingdom. The prolonged succession crisis that had nearly destroyed the Hittite kingdom in the wake of Masili I's assassination created the conditions that would ultimately lead to one of the most important constitutional developments in ancient Near Eastern history. When Telepinu finally secured the throne around 1525 BCE, he faced a kingdom torn apart by decades of civil war, weakened by the loss of conquered territories, and plagued by the constant threat of renewed dynastic violence. The new king recognized that the fundamental problem lay not in the ambitions of individual nobles or the external pressures facing the kingdom, but in the absence of clear, legally binding procedures for royal succession that could prevent future crises. The Edict of Telepinu, promulgated early in his reign, represented a revolutionary approach to the problem of dynastic stability that would influence royal succession practices throughout the ancient world. The document, preserved in multiple copies discovered in the royal archives at Hattusa, established detailed procedures for determining legitimate heirs to the throne and created institutional mechanisms for preventing the kind of palace conspiracies that had plagued previous reigns. The edict's provisions reflected Telepinu's careful analysis of the causes of recent instability and his determination to create a constitutional framework that could survive the ambitions of future rulers and nobles. The succession law established a clear hierarchy of inheritance that prioritized the king's sons according to their birth order, while also providing for alternative arrangements in cases where the direct male line failed to produce suitable heirs. The edict specified that the crown prince must be formally designated during the king's lifetime, and that this designation required the approval of the royal council, a body composed of senior nobles, military commanders, and religious officials. This requirement ensured that succession decisions involved consultation with the kingdom's most powerful figures, while preventing any single faction from imposing its preferred candidate without broader support. The legal framework created by Telepinu's edict also addressed the problem of regency during periods when the designated heir was too young to rule effectively. The document established procedures for appointing regents and defined their powers and limitations, preventing the kind of power struggles that had previously erupted when child kings inherited the throne. The edict required that regents be chosen from among the king's close relatives and that their authority be subject to oversight by the royal council, creating checks and balances that prevented any individual from using a regency to usurp royal power. The constitutional innovations introduced by Telepinu extended beyond succession procedures to encompass broader reforms in royal administration and the relationship between the crown and the nobility. The edict established formal procedures for the appointment of provincial governors and defined their responsibilities and authority, creating a more systematic approach to imperial administration that reduced the autonomy previously enjoyed by regional nobles. The document also specified the obligations of nobles to provide military service and financial support to the crown, while guaranteeing certain rights and privileges that protected them from arbitrary royal action. The implementation of these constitutional reforms required extensive changes in the administrative apparatus of the Hittite kingdom. Telepinu established new bureaucratic positions responsible for maintaining records of royal decisions, monitoring compliance with legal procedures, and ensuring that succession laws were properly observed. The king's scribes created detailed archives documenting the genealogies of royal and noble families, providing the information necessary to resolve future disputes about inheritance rights and succession claims. The military innovations that characterized Telepinu's reign and continued throughout the Old Kingdom period reflected both the technological developments occurring throughout the ancient Near East and the specific strategic challenges facing the Hittite Empire. The adoption of horse-drawn chariots represented perhaps the most significant transformation in Hittite military capabilities, fundamentally altering battlefield tactics and requiring extensive changes in training, logistics, and military organization. The chariot forces that emerged during this period combined the mobility advantages of cavalry with the shock power of heavy infantry, creating a flexible military instrument that could adapt to various tactical situations. The development of Hittite chariot warfare required the establishment of extensive horse breeding programs and the training of specialized personnel capable of maintaining and operating these complex military systems. The kingdom's horse farms, located primarily in the grasslands of central Anatolia, produced animals selected for their speed, endurance, and suitability for military service. The training of chariot crews involved not only the development of driving skills, but also the coordination between driver and warrior that was essential for effective battlefield performance. The tactical employment of chariots in Hittite armies involved their integration with traditional infantry formations and the development of new battlefield strategies that maximized their effectiveness. Hittite commanders learned to use chariot forces for reconnaissance, pursuit of defeated enemies, and the disruption of enemy formations, while relying on infantry for the close combat that ultimately decided most engagements. The psychological impact of mass chariot charges proved particularly effective against opponents who lacked experience fighting these new weapon systems. The metallurgical advances that accompanied these military innovations reflected the Hittites' access to Anatolia's rich mineral resources and their contacts with metalworking traditions from throughout the ancient world. The development of improved bronze alloys produced weapons and tools that were harder, more durable, and more effective than previous generations of metal implements. Hittite smiths experimented with different combinations of copper, tin, and other metals to create specialized alloys suited for particular applications, from the flexible bronze required for chariot fittings to the hard alloys needed for weapon blades. The early adoption of iron technology gave Hittite armies significant advantages over opponents who continued to rely primarily on bronze weapons. The transition to iron production required the development of new smelting techniques and the training of smiths capable of working with the higher temperatures and different chemical processes involved in iron metallurgy. The superior hardness and edge retention of iron weapons made them particularly effective in close combat, while the relative abundance of iron ore compared to the tin required for bronze production provided economic advantages that supported larger military forces. The siege warfare techniques developed during this period reflected the Hittites' experience in attacking the fortified cities that dominated the political landscape of the ancient Near East. Hittite engineers perfected the construction of siege ramps, battering rams, and other specialized equipment designed to breach defensive walls and overcome the advantages enjoyed by defenders. The development of these techniques required extensive knowledge of construction engineering, mathematics, and the properties of different building materials. The diplomatic revolution that characterized the Old Kingdom period established the Hittite Empire as a major player in the complex international system that governed relations between the great powers of the ancient Near East. The kingdom's diplomatic correspondence, preserved in the royal archives at Hattusa, reveals a sophisticated understanding of international law, treaty negotiation, and the maintenance of peaceful relations with neighboring powers. The Hittite diplomatic service developed standardized procedures for conducting negotiations, exchanging ambassadors, and resolving disputes that became models for international relations throughout the region. The treaty negotiations with Egypt during this period established precedents for international agreements that would influence diplomatic practice for centuries. The Hittite negotiators demonstrated remarkable skill in balancing their kingdom's interests with the need to maintain peaceful relations with a powerful neighbor whose military capabilities rivaled their own. The treaties addressed issues ranging from territorial boundaries and trade relations to the extradition of political refugees and the treatment of each kingdom's subjects in the other's territory. The diplomatic relations with Assyria involved different challenges, as the Mesopotamian kingdom represented both a potential ally against common enemies and a competitor for influence in the strategically important regions of northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. Hittite diplomats learned to navigate the complex political situation in Mesopotamia, where multiple powers competed for dominance and alliances shifted frequently in response to changing military and economic circumstances. The correspondence between Hittite and Assyrian courts reveals the sophisticated intelligence networks that both kingdoms maintained to monitor political developments throughout the region. The relationship with the Mitanni kingdom presented perhaps the most complex diplomatic challenge facing Hittite negotiators during this period. The Hurrian-dominated state controlled territories that the Hittites considered essential for their security and economic prosperity, while Mitanni rulers viewed Hittite expansion as a direct threat to their own imperial ambitions. The diplomatic correspondence between these powers reveals the careful balance of threats and inducements that characterize their relationship, with both sides seeking to avoid costly military confrontations while protecting their essential interests. The establishment of international correspondence protocols during this period created standardized procedures for diplomatic communication that facilitated more effective negotiations and reduced the likelihood of misunderstandings that could lead to conflict. The Hittite diplomatic service developed expertise in the various languages and writing systems used throughout the ancient Near East, ensuring that their communications could be understood by their intended recipients. The royal archives contain correspondence in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the period, as well as documents in Egyptian hieroglyphs, Hurrian, and other languages reflecting the international scope of Hittite diplomacy. The religious and cultural synthesis that occurred during the Old Kingdom period created the distinctive civilization that would characterize the Hittite Empire throughout its history. The integration of Hittite, Hattian, and Hurrian religious traditions produced a complex pantheon that reflected the diverse populations under Hittite rule, while maintaining the political and ideological unity necessary for effective imperial administration. The process of religious syncretism involved not simply the adoption of foreign deities, but their transformation and reinterpretation within a specifically Hittite theological framework. The worship of the storm god Teshub exemplifies the sophisticated process of religious synthesis that characterized this period. The deity combined attributes of the Indo-European sky god, worshipped by the original Hittite population, with characteristics of the Hattian storm god Tarhunt and the Hurrian weather deity of the same name. The resulting composite figure served as the patron of Hittite kingship, while maintaining connections to the agricultural cycles and natural phenomena that were central to the religious life of the empire's diverse populations. The integration of Hattian earth goddess traditions into Hittite religious practice demonstrates the extent to which the conquerors adopted and transformed indigenous Anatolian beliefs. The goddess Araniti, who became central to Hittite royal ideology, combined the solar attributes associated with Indo-European divine kingship with the Earth Mother characteristics of pre-Indo-European Anatolian religion. The elaborate festivals celebrating this deity involved processions to sacred sites throughout the kingdom, creating shared religious experiences that reinforced political unity while respecting local traditions. The absorption of Hurrian religious practices reflected the growing influence of this population within the Hittite Empire and the kingdom's expansion into regions where Hurrian culture predominated. The adoption of Hurrian deities such as Shaushka and Kumarbi involved their incorporation into existing Hittite religious hierarchies and their association with particular aspects of royal authority and divine protection. The process required the training of Hittite priests in Hurrian ritual practices and the translation of religious texts into languages that could be understood by the empire's diverse populations. The development of religious festivals during this period created elaborate ceremonial cycles that served both spiritual and political functions within the Hittite Empire. The seasonal celebrations that marked important agricultural and astronomical events provided opportunities for the king to demonstrate his divine sanction and his role as intermediary between the gods and his subjects. These festivals involved processions to sacred sites throughout the kingdom, creating networks of religious activity that reinforced political control while providing shared experiences that helped integrate diverse populations into a common imperial culture. The constitutional foundations established by Telepinu's reforms created the stable political framework that would enable the Hittite kingdom to achieve its greatest territorial expansion and international prominence under the leadership of Suppiluliuma I. When this remarkable ruler ascended to the throne around 1344 BCE, he inherited a kingdom that had weathered the storms of dynastic crisis and emerged with stronger institutions, more effective military capabilities, and a clearer sense of its imperial destiny. The reign of Suppiluliuma first would transform the Hittite state from a regional Anatolian power into a true empire that commanded respect from Egypt to Mesopotamia and fundamentally altered the balance of power throughout the ancient Near East. The strategic vision that guided Suppiluliuma I's imperial expansion reflected his sophisticated understanding of the changing political landscape in the regions surrounding the Hittite heartland. The weakening of Egyptian influence in Syria and Palestine, combined with the internal instability plaguing the Mitanni kingdom, created opportunities for territorial expansion that a less capable ruler might have failed to recognize or exploit effectively. Suppiluliuma I's military campaigns were characterized not by opportunistic raiding, but by systematic conquest designed to establish permanent Hittite control over strategically important territories and trade routes. The conquest of the Mitanni kingdom represented the most significant achievement of Suppiluliuma I's reign and demonstrated the effectiveness of the military and diplomatic strategies that would characterize Hittite imperial expansion throughout this period. The Mitanni state, which had dominated northern Mesopotamia and Syria for over a century, possessed formidable military capabilities and controlled territories that were essential for any power seeking to dominate the trade routes connecting Anatolia with the Levant and Mesopotamia. The systematic dismantling of Mitanni power required years of careful planning, the the coordination of multiple military campaigns, and the skillful exploitation of internal divisions within the enemy kingdom. The initial phases of the Mitanni campaign involved the systematic reduction of frontier fortresses and the establishment of Hittite bases in the mountainous regions that separated the two kingdoms. Suppiluliuma's forces constructed fortified camps at strategic locations that could serve as supply depots and staging areas for deeper penetration into Mitanni territory. These preliminary operations required the development of new logistical systems capable of supporting large armies operating far from the Anatolian heartland, including the establishment of supply lines that could function despite enemy harassment and the challenges of operating in unfamiliar terrain. The siege of Washukani, the Mitanni capital, showcased the sophisticated siege warfare techniques that Hittite engineers had developed during the previous century of military innovation. The city's massive walls and complex defensive systems had been designed to withstand prolonged sieges, but Hittite forces employed a combination of direct assault siege engines and systematic undermining that eventually breached the defences. The capture of the capital effectively ended organised Mitanni resistance and provided the Hittites with access to the kingdom's treasury, archives, and administrative apparatus. The incorporation of former Mitanni territories into the expanding Hittite Empire required innovative approaches to imperial administration that would accommodate the diverse populations and established political structures of the conquered regions. Rather than attempting to impose direct Hittite rule throughout the former Mitanni kingdom, Suppiluliuma first developed a system of vassal relationships that preserved local autonomy while ensuring Hittite control over strategic decisions and military resources. This approach proved particularly effective in Syria, where numerous city-states had previously acknowledged Mitanni suzerainty and could be induced to transfer their allegiance to the Hittite king. The establishment of Hittite control over northern Syria brought the expanding empire into direct contact with Egyptian spheres of influence and created the conditions for the diplomatic revolution that would characterize international relations throughout the late Bronze Age. The Amarna letters, discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital city, provide unprecedented insight into the complex negotiations and political maneuvering that accompanied this transformation of the regional balance of power. The correspondence reveals that Hittite diplomats possessed sophisticated understanding of Egyptian court politics and were capable of exploiting the religious and political upheavals associated with Akhenaten's reign to advance their own territorial ambitions. The marriage negotiations between Hittite princesses and Egyptian pharaohs represented one of the most innovative diplomatic strategies employed during this period. These proposed unions were designed not merely to cement political alliances, but to create permanent links between the two royal houses that would prevent future conflicts and provide mechanisms for resolving disputes through negotiation rather than warfare. The detailed correspondence surrounding these negotiations reveals the careful attention that both courts paid to questions of protocol, religious compatibility, and the political implications of such unprecedented arrangements. The diplomatic exchanges with the Egyptian court during the reign of Tutankhamun demonstrate the extent to which the Hittites had established themselves as equals of the traditional great powers of the ancient Near East. When the young pharaoh's widow, possibly Ankhesenamun, wrote to Suppiluliuma, requesting one of his sons as a husband, the correspondence revealed the dramatic shift in regional power relationships that had occurred during the previous decades. The Egyptian queen's letter, preserved in Hittite archives, expressed her desperation at the prospect of marrying one of her servants and her hope that a Hittite prince could provide the political stability that Egypt desperately needed. Suppiluliuma, Thus, response to this extraordinary request demonstrates the careful calculation that characterized Hittite diplomacy during this period. The king initially expressed skepticism about the authenticity of the Egyptian overture, dispatching his own ambassador to verify the queen's identity and the political situation in Egypt. The subsequent negotiations involved complex discussions about the status that a Hittite prince would enjoy in Egypt, the religious obligations he would be expected to fulfill, and the implications of such a union for the relationship between the two kingdoms. The tragic fate of Prince Senanza, who was murdered while travelling to Egypt to marry the Egyptian queen, illustrates the dangers inherent in the ambitious diplomatic strategies pursued during this period. The prince's death, apparently at the hands of Egyptian officials who opposed the marriage alliance, provoked a military response from Suppiluliuma that further demonstrated Hittite military capabilities. The subsequent campaigns in Egyptian-controlled territories of Syria and Palestine showed that the Hittites possessed the logistical capabilities and military resources necessary to project power far beyond their traditional spheres of influence. The administrative innovations that accompanied Hittite territorial expansion during this period created the governmental structures that would enable the empire to function effectively despite its enormous geographical extent and cultural diversity. The development of provincial administration systems involved the appointment of governors who possessed both the military capabilities necessary to maintain order and the administrative skills required to collect taxes, organize military levies, and implement royal policies. These officials were typically drawn from the Hittite nobility, but were expected to work closely with local elites who retained significant authority within their traditional spheres of influence. The treaty obligations that governed relationships between the Hittite king and his vassal rulers created a complex web of legal and political relationships that defined the structure of the imperial system. These agreements, preserved in numerous copies discovered in archives throughout the former Hittite territories, established detailed procedures for military cooperation, tribute payment, and the resolution of disputes between different components of the empire. The treaties also defined the religious obligations of vassal rulers, requiring them to participate in ceremonies that acknowledged the supremacy of Hittite deities, while generally permitting the continuation of local religious practices. The standardization of administrative procedures throughout the empire required the development of training programs for officials and the establishment of communication systems that could function effectively across vast distances and diverse linguistic environments. The royal scribal schools at Hattusa produced administrators capable of working in multiple languages and familiar with the legal and administrative traditions of different regions within the empire. These officials served as the essential link between the central government and the diverse populations under Hittite rule, translating royal policies into terms that could be understood and implemented by local authorities. The economic integration of conquered territories into the Hittite imperial system involved the development of new trade networks and the standardization of weights, measures, and currency systems that facilitated commercial exchange throughout the empire. The control of strategic trade routes that connected Anatolia with Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt provided the Hittites with access to luxury goods and raw materials that were essential for maintaining the loyalty of the nobility and supporting the elaborate court ceremonies that legitimized royal authority. The tribute obligations imposed on vassal territories provided additional resources that supported the military forces and administrative apparatus necessary for imperial governance. The cultural and technological achievements that characterized the imperial period reflected both the increased resources available to the Hittite state and the cultural exchange that resulted from the empire's expansion into regions with different technological and artistic traditions. The development of advanced metallurgical techniques produced weapons and tools that were superior to those available to most contemporary powers, while the adoption of new architectural styles and decorative motifs created a distinctive imperial aesthetic that combined Hittite, Hurrian, and Syrian influences. The advances in iron metallurgy during this period gave Hittite armies significant advantages over opponents who continued to rely primarily on bronze weapons and tools. The development of more efficient smelting techniques and the discovery of new sources of iron ore in the Anatolian highlands enabled the Hittites to produce iron implements on a scale that was unprecedented in the ancient world. The superior hardness and durability of iron weapons made them particularly effective in close combat, while the relative abundance of iron ore compared to the tin required for bronze production provided economic advantages that supported larger military forces. The architectural innovations that transformed Hattusa during this period created monumental buildings that served both practical and symbolic functions within the imperial system. The expansion of the royal palace complex involved the construction of new ceremonial halls, administrative buildings, and residential quarters that could accommodate the growing complexity of imperial government. The famous Lion Gate and King's Gate, with their massive stone sculptures and sophisticated defensive systems, demonstrated Hittite engineering capabilities while serving as powerful symbols of royal authority and divine protection. The development of the Hittite cuneiform writing system during this period reflected the need for more efficient methods of record-keeping and communication within the expanding empire. the adaptation of Mesopotamian cuneiform script to the unique phonological characteristics of the Hittite language required extensive experimentation and the development of new conventions for representing sounds that did not exist in Akkadian or Sumerian. The resulting writing system proved capable of recording not only administrative documents and legal texts, but also the complex religious and literary works that formed an essential component of Hittite imperial culture. The preservation of thousands of cuneiform tablets in the royal archives at Hattusa provides unprecedented insight into the daily operations of an ancient imperial government and the challenges involved in governing diverse populations across vast territories. The administrative correspondence reveals the constant flow of information between the capital and provincial centres, including reports on military activities, economic conditions and political developments that required royal attention. The legal documents demonstrate the sophistication of Hittite jurisprudence and the efforts made to ensure consistent application of imperial law throughout the diverse territories under Hittite control. The religious innovations that accompanied imperial expansion involved the systematic integration of local deities and religious practices into the broader framework of Hittite state religion. The process of religious syncretism required careful negotiation between central authorities and local religious establishments, as the Hittites sought to maintain political control while avoiding the kind of religious conflicts that could undermine imperial stability. The resulting religious system combined elements from throughout the empire while maintaining the theological framework that legitimized Hittite royal authority and provided ideological unity for the diverse imperial population. The death of Suppiluliuma, around 1322 BCE, marked the end of an era of unprecedented Hittite expansion, but the imperial system he had constructed would face its greatest test under his successors as Egypt reasserted its traditional claims to hegemony over the Levant. The accession of Muwatalli II to the Hittite throne around 1295 BCE coincided with the rise of Seti I in Egypt, creating a collision course between two imperial powers whose territorial ambitions could no longer be reconciled through diplomatic accommodation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future balance of power in the ancient Near East and test the military innovations that both empires had developed during their respective periods of expansion. The strategic importance of Syria and the Levant to both empires cannot be overstated, as these regions controlled the vital trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with Mesopotamia and provided access to the luxury goods and raw materials that sustained the elaborate court systems of both kingdoms. The Hittite Empire's control over northern Syria, established through Suppiluliuma's systematic dismantling of Mitanni power, brought substantial tribute revenues and provided strategic depth for the defence of Anatolia. Egyptian control over southern Syria and Palestine, maintained through a network of vassal relationships and fortified garrisons, secured the kingdom's northeastern frontier and provided access to the cedar forests of Lebanon and the copper mines of the Sinai Peninsula. The economic dimensions of this rivalry extended beyond simple territorial control to encompass fundamental questions about the structure of international trade and the distribution of wealth throughout the region. The Hittite Empire's expansion into Syria had disrupted traditional trade patterns that had channeled goods through Egyptian-controlled territories, creating alternative routes that reduced Egyptian customs revenues and weakened the economic foundations of pharaonic power. The competition for control over key commercial centres such as Kadesh, Aleppo and Damascus involved not merely military conquest, but the establishment of administrative systems capable of regulating trade, collecting taxes, and maintaining the infrastructure necessary for commercial activity. The tribute obligations imposed by both empires on their Syrian vassals created overlapping and often contradictory demands that placed local rulers in impossible positions. Cities that had traditionally paid tribute to Egypt found themselves under pressure to acknowledge Hittite suzerainty, while territories that had been incorporated into the Hittite sphere during Suppiluliuma Fern's campaigns faced Egyptian demands for renewed submission. The resulting political instability provided opportunities for ambitious local rulers to play the two great powers against each other, but it also created conditions that made military confrontation increasingly inevitable. Muwatalli II's strategic preparations for the coming conflict with Egypt demonstrated the sophisticated military planning capabilities that the Hittite Empire had developed during its period of expansion. The king's decision to relocate his capital from Hattusa to Tarantassa closer to the Syrian frontier, reflected his understanding that the defense of Hittite interests in the Levant would require sustained military commitment and the ability to respond rapidly to Egyptian initiatives. The new capital's location in southern Anatolia provided better access to the empire's Syrian territories while maintaining secure communications with the traditional Hittite heartland. The military preparations undertaken by Mu'tali II involved the mobilization of resources from throughout the Hittite Empire and the coordination of forces drawn from diverse populations with different military traditions and capabilities. The king's army included not only the traditional Hittite infantry and chariot forces, but also contingents from vassal states throughout Anatolia and northern Syria. The integration of these diverse military units required extensive training and the development of standardized tactical procedures that could accommodate different fighting styles and weapon systems. The Hittite military machine that emerged from these preparations represented the culmination of centuries of military innovation and adaptation. The empire's chariot forces, organized into units of varying sizes and equipped with different types of vehicles suited for specific tactical roles, provided the mobility and shock power necessary for operations in the open terrain of Syria. The three-man Hittite war chariots, heavier and more stable than their Egyptian counterparts, carried a driver, a warrior armed with spears and composite bows, and a shield-bearer who provided protection and could assist in close combat if necessary. The infantry formations that supported these chariot forces reflected the diverse military traditions of the Hittite Empire's constituent populations. The core units consisted of Hittite spearmen equipped with bronze-tipped weapons and large shields, trained in the close order formations that had proven effective in the mountainous terrain of Anatolia. These forces were supplemented by contingents of Luwian archers, whose composite bows provided long-range firepower, and Syrian infantry units familiar with the tactical requirements of warfare in their homeland's plains and river valleys. The siege warfare capabilities that the Hittites had developed during their expansion into fortified regions proved crucial for the Syrian campaigns, as control of key cities required the ability to reduce heavily fortified positions defended by professional garrisons. Hittite engineers had perfected techniques for constructing siege ramps, operating battering rams, and undermining defensive walls that enabled their forces to overcome even the most formidable fortifications. The systematic approach to siege warfare involved the coordination of multiple specialized units, including engineers responsible for constructing siege works, archers who provided covering fire, and assault troops trained in urban combat. The Egyptian military response to Hittite expansion reflected the kingdom's own military innovations and its determination to maintain traditional spheres of influence, despite the changing balance of power in the region. Setiyer's campaigns in Palestine and southern Syria demonstrated Egyptian capabilities in rapid deployment and the coordination of forces drawn from throughout the Nile Valley. The pharaoh's army included elite units such as the Shurden Guard, foreign mercenaries whose distinctive equipment and fighting techniques supplemented traditional Egyptian military capabilities. The Egyptian chariot forces that would play a crucial role in the coming confrontation represented the pinnacle of New Kingdom military technology and organization. The lighter, more maneuverable Egyptian chariots, typically crewed by two men rather than the three-man Hittite teams, emphasized speed and flexibility over raw combat power. Egyptian chariot tactics relied on rapid movement, concentrated archery fire, and the ability to disengage quickly when faced with superior enemy forces. The composite bows used by Egyptian chariot crews could deliver accurate fire at longer ranges than most contemporary weapons, providing significant tactical advantages in the open terrain where chariot warfare was most effective. The infantry components of Egyptian armies reflected the kingdom's access to diverse populations throughout the Nile Valley and its extensive use of foreign mercenaries and auxiliary troops. The core units consisted of Egyptian spearmen and archers trained in the disciplined formations that had proven effective in the kingdom's previous campaigns. These forces were supplemented by Nubian archers renowned for their marksmanship, Libyan light infantry skilled in skirmishing tactics, and various mercenary units recruited from throughout the Mediterranean world. The diplomatic maneuvering that preceded the military confrontation involved both empires in complex negotiations with potential allies and attempts to secure the loyalty of Syrian vassal states, whose allegiance would prove crucial in the coming conflict. The Hittite diplomatic service, building on the precedents established during Suppiluliuma of Vern's reign, sought to maintain the loyalty of established vassals while encouraging Egyptian client states to defect. The extensive correspondence preserved in Hittite archives reveals the sophisticated intelligence networks that both empires maintained throughout Syria and the careful attention paid to political developments that might affect the regional balance of power. The Egyptian diplomatic efforts focused on reasserting traditional claims to suzerainty over territories that had acknowledged pharaonic authority during the empire's earlier period of expansion. Egyptian diplomats emphasized the kingdom's historical role as protector of Syrian cities and its ability to provide military support against Hittite aggression. The diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals the complex negotiations involved in securing military cooperation from vassal states and the various inducements offered to ensure their continued loyalty. The city of Kadesh emerged as the focal point of these competing imperial ambitions due to its strategic location on the Orontes River and its control over crucial trade routes connecting northern and southern Syria. The city's massive fortifications, constructed over centuries of military conflict, made it a formidable obstacle to any army seeking to advance through the region. The loyalty of Kadesh's ruler, Muwatalli, to the Hittite cause provided the empire with a crucial forward base for operations against Egyptian forces, while Egyptian control of the city would have opened the route to Hittite territories in northern Syria. The preliminary campaigns that preceded the major confrontation at Kadesh involved both empires in systematic efforts to secure their respective spheres of influence and prepare for the decisive battle that both sides recognized as inevitable. Egyptian forces under Seti I conducted successful operations in Palestine and southern Syria, re-establishing pharaonic control over territories that had been lost during the previous period of Egyptian weakness. These campaigns demonstrated Egyptian military capabilities while providing valuable intelligence about Hittite defensive preparations and the loyalty of various Syrian vassals. The Hittite response to these Egyptian initiatives involved reinforcing key defensive positions throughout northern Syria and conducting diplomatic missions designed to maintain the loyalty of vassal states facing Egyptian pressure. Muwatalli II's forces strengthened the fortifications of Kadesh and other strategic cities, while establishing supply depots and communication networks that would support sustained military operations. The king's diplomatic efforts focused on reassuring Syrian vassals of Hittite military support, while encouraging them to resist Egyptian demands for renewed submission. The intelligence-gathering activities conducted by both empires during this period reveal the sophisticated espionage networks that had developed to support military planning and diplomatic negotiations. Hittite agents operating in Egyptian-controlled territories provided detailed information about enemy troop movements, fortification improvements, and political developments that might affect military operations. Egyptian intelligence services maintained similar networks throughout Hittite territories, gathering information about enemy capabilities and intentions that would prove crucial for tactical planning. The logistical preparations required for the massive military operations that both empires were planning involved unprecedented mobilization of resources and the development of supply systems capable of supporting large armies operating far from their home bases. The Hittite Empire's extensive network of vassal states provided access to local resources and manpower, while the kingdom's control over key trade routes enabled the accumulation of supplies and equipment necessary for sustained military operations. The Egyptian military machine drew on the wealth of the Nile Valley and the kingdom's extensive international trade connections to assemble the resources necessary for a major campaign in Syria. The accumulation of forces that preceded the Battle of Kadesh represented the largest military mobilization that either empire had ever undertaken. Muwatalli II's army, assembled from throughout the Hittite Empire and its vassal territories, included an estimated 50,000 men organized into infantry, chariot and support units, drawn from dozens of different populations. The diversity of this force reflected the empire's multi-ethnic character, but also created challenges in terms of command, control and tactical coordination that would prove significant during the coming battle. The Egyptian expeditionary force assembled by Ramses II for the Kadesh campaign represented a similar mobilization of resources and demonstrated the kingdom's ability to project power far beyond the Nile Valley. The pharaoh's army, organized into 4 divisions named after major Egyptian deities, included elite units from throughout the kingdom as well as foreign mercenaries and auxiliary troops. The total force probably numbered around 20,000 men, smaller than the Hittite army, but composed of more homogeneous units with standardized equipment and training. The aftermath of the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE left both the Hittite and Egyptian empires in a state of strategic exhaustion, having demonstrated their military capabilities while simultaneously revealing the futility of attempting to achieve decisive victory through purely military means. The massive casualties suffered by both sides, combined with the enormous financial costs of maintaining such large armies in distant territories, created conditions that made continued warfare increasingly unsustainable. Mu'tali II's tactical success in preventing Egyptian forces from advancing beyond Kadesh came at the price of heavy losses among his elite chariot units and the depletion of resources that had taken years to accumulate. Similarly, Ramses II's ability to extract his forces from what could have been a catastrophic defeat required the expenditure of Egypt's strategic reserves and left the kingdom vulnerable to threats from other directions. The strategic stalemate that emerged from the Kadesh campaign forced both empires to reconsider their fundamental approaches to regional dominance and territorial expansion. The Hittite Empire's control over northern Syria remained secure, but the costs of defending these territories against sustained Egyptian pressure had proven prohibitive. The extensive network of fortifications, supply depots, and communication systems required to maintain Hittite presence in the Levant demanded constant investment of resources and manpower that could have been deployed more effectively in other regions. The Egyptian position in southern Syria and Palestine remained intact, but the kingdom's inability to break through Hittite defences demonstrated the limits of Pharaonic military power and the need for alternative strategies to secure Egyptian interests in the region. The diplomatic initiatives that emerged from this strategic impasse reflected the sophisticated understanding of international relations that both empires had developed during their centuries of expansion and conflict. The preliminary negotiations that began in the years following Kadesh involved complex discussions about territorial boundaries, trade relationships, and the status of vassal states that had been caught between the competing imperial systems. The Hittite diplomatic service, building on the precedents established during Suppiluliuma Fern's reign, approached these negotiations with a clear understanding of the empire's strategic priorities and the concessions that would be necessary to achieve a lasting settlement. The Egyptian diplomatic apparatus, reorganized under Ramses II's direct supervision, demonstrated similar sophistication in its approach to the complex issues that had to be resolved before any meaningful agreement could be reached. The pharaoh's negotiators possessed detailed knowledge of Hittite internal politics, military capabilities, and economic constraints that enabled them to identify areas where Egyptian interests could be advanced through diplomatic rather than military means. The extensive correspondence that preceded the formal treaty negotiations reveals the careful attention that both sides paid to questions of protocol, precedents, and the symbolic dimensions of international agreements. The personal relationship that developed between Ramses II and Hattusili III proved crucial for the success of the diplomatic process that culminated in the famous peace treaty of 1259 BCE. Hattusili III's accession to the Hittite throne, following his nephew Uhi-Teshub's deposition, had created internal instability within the empire that made the new king particularly receptive to Egyptian overtures for peaceful resolution of their territorial disputes. The Hittite ruler's need to consolidate his domestic position and address threats from Assyria in the east provided additional incentives for reaching accommodation with Egypt that would free resources for other priorities. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty of 1259 BCE represents one of the most significant diplomatic achievements in ancient Near Eastern history, establishing principles of international law and peaceful coexistence that would influence diplomatic practice for centuries. The treaty's provisions, preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphic and Hittite cuneiform versions, addressed the fundamental issues that had driven the two empires into conflict while creating mechanisms for preventing future disputes from escalating into warfare. The agreement's emphasis on mutual recognition of territorial boundaries, non-aggression obligations, and cooperative security arrangements reflected the sophisticated understanding of international relations that both empires had developed through their extensive diplomatic experience. The territorial provisions of the treaty established clear boundaries between Egyptian and Hittite spheres of influence that recognized the military realities created by decades of warfare, while providing both empires with secure access to the resources and trade routes they considered essential. The agreement confirmed Hittite control over northern Syria, including the crucial cities of Kadesh and Aleppo, while acknowledging Egyptian hegemony over southern Syria and Palestine. The precise demarcation of these boundaries required extensive negotiations about the status of individual cities and the rights of passage for merchants and diplomatic personnel travelling between the two empires. The mutual defence provisions of the treaty created unprecedented arrangements for military cooperation between powers that had been bitter enemies for generations. The agreement obligated both empires to provide military assistance against external threats, creating a defensive alliance that would prove crucial for maintaining regional stability in the face of growing Assyrian power. The treaty's provisions for intelligence sharing and coordinated military planning established mechanisms for cooperation that extended far beyond the simple non-aggression agreements that had characterized previous diplomatic settlements. The extradition clauses included in the treaty addressed practical problems that had complicated relations between the two empires throughout their period of conflict. The agreement established procedures for the return of political refugees, escaped slaves, and other individuals who had fled from one empire to the other, creating legal frameworks that would prevent such cases from becoming sources of diplomatic friction. The treaty's provisions for the protection of merchants and other travellers created safe passage arrangements that facilitated increased trade and cultural exchange between the two empires. The religious dimensions of the treaty reflected the important role that divine sanction played in legitimizing international agreements throughout the ancient Near East. The document invoked the protection of both Egyptian and Hittite deities, creating spiritual obligations that reinforced the political and military commitments outlined in the agreement. The elaborate ceremonies that accompanied the treaty's ratification involved priests from both empires in rituals designed to ensure divine approval for the peaceful settlement and to invoke supernatural punishment for any party that violated the agreement's terms. The implementation of the treaty's provisions required the development of new administrative procedures and the establishment of permanent diplomatic relations between the two empires. The agreement created the world's first known system of permanent diplomatic representation, with Egyptian and Hittite ambassadors maintaining regular residences in each other's capitals. These diplomatic missions served not only as channels for official communication, but also as centres for intelligence gathering and cultural exchange that deepened understanding between the two civilizations. The establishment of regular diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian and Hittite courts created unprecedented opportunities for the peaceful resolution of disputes and the coordination of policies on matters of mutual interest. The preserved letters between Ramses II and Hattusili III reveal the personal relationships that developed between the two rulers and their families, creating bonds of friendship and mutual respect that transcended the political calculations that had initially motivated the peace settlement. The correspondence also demonstrates the sophisticated diplomatic protocols that governed international communication and the careful attention paid to questions of precedence and ceremonial detail. The marriage alliance between Ramses II and Hattusili III's daughter represented the culmination of the diplomatic revolution that had transformed relations between the two empires. The elaborate negotiations that preceded this unprecedented union involved complex discussions about the princess's status within the Egyptian court, her religious obligations, and the political implications of such a marriage for both kingdoms. The wedding ceremony itself, conducted with unprecedented splendor in the Egyptian capital, symbolized the complete transformation of the relationship between two powers that had been locked in deadly conflict for generations. The economic benefits that flowed from the peace settlement created new opportunities for prosperity and development throughout both empires. The security provided by the treaty enabled merchants to travel safely between Egyptian and Hittite territories, leading to increased trade in luxury goods, raw materials, and manufactured products. The Hittite Empire's access to Egyptian gold and African ivory, combined with Egypt's ability to import Anatolian silver and copper, created new sources of wealth that supported the elaborate court cultures and monumental building projects that characterized both civilizations during this period. The cultural exchange that accompanied increased diplomatic and commercial contact produced innovations in art, literature, and technology that enriched both civilizations. Egyptian artistic techniques and decorative motifs appeared in Hittite royal palaces and temples, while Hittite military technology and administrative practices influenced Egyptian governmental systems. The translation of literary works between the two languages created new forms of cultural expression that combined elements from both traditions, producing hybrid forms that reflected the cosmopolitan character of the late Bronze Age world. The reign of Hattusili III witnessed unprecedented prosperity and cultural achievement throughout the Hittite Empire, as the resources previously devoted to military confrontation with Egypt were redirected toward internal development and territorial consolidation. The king's building programs transformed Hattusa into one of the most impressive capitals in the ancient world, with massive stone fortifications, elaborate temple complexes, and administrative buildings that demonstrated the empire's wealth and technological sophistication. The famous Lion Gate and King's Gate, with their monumental sculptures and sophisticated defensive systems, created architectural landmarks that symbolized Hittite power and artistic achievement. The expansion of the royal palace complex at Hattusa during this period created facilities that could accommodate the increasingly elaborate ceremonial requirements of imperial administration. The new audience halls, with their massive stone columns and elaborate decorative programs, provided settings for the reception of foreign ambassadors and the conduct of state ceremonies that reinforced the king's authority and the empire's prestige. The residential quarters constructed for the royal family and court officials reflected the growing sophistication of Hittite domestic architecture and the influence of international artistic styles. The temple building programs initiated during Hattusili III's reign created religious complexes that served both spiritual and political functions within the imperial system. The Great Temple at Hattusa, dedicated to the storm god Teshub and the sun goddess Ariniti, represented the culmination of Hittite religious architecture and provided a focal point for the elaborate festivals that reinforced royal authority and imperial unity. The temple's massive stone foundations, sophisticated drainage systems, and elaborate storage facilities demonstrated the engineering capabilities that the Hittites had developed during their centuries of urban construction. The development of provincial centres throughout the empire during this period created networks of administrative and religious sites that extended royal authority into the most remote regions of Hittite territory. The construction of fortified palaces, temples, and administrative buildings in cities such as Alaka Hoyuk, Masat Hoyuk, and Kusakli provided local centres for imperial administration, while creating architectural monuments that demonstrated Hittite power and cultural achievement. These provincial building programs required the coordination of skilled craftsmen, raw materials, and financial resources on a scale that demonstrated the empire's organizational capabilities and economic prosperity. The legal reforms implemented during Hattusili III's reign created more sophisticated system for administering justice and maintaining order throughout the diverse territories under Hittite control. The revised law codes addressed issues ranging from property rights and commercial transactions to criminal penalties and family relationships, providing comprehensive frameworks for resolving disputes and maintaining social stability. The legal innovations reflected the empire's experience in governing diverse populations and the need for flexible systems that could accommodate different cultural traditions while maintaining imperial unity. The judicial procedures established during this period created hierarchical court systems that could handle the increasing complexity of legal disputes arising from the empire's territorial expansion and cultural diversity. Local magistrates received enhanced training in Hittite law and administrative procedures, while regional governors were granted expanded authority to resolve disputes that crossed traditional jurisdictional boundaries. The development of standardized legal procedures and the establishment of appeals processes created more effective mechanisms for ensuring consistent application of imperial law throughout the empire's diverse territories. The religious innovations that characterized Hattusili III's reign reflected the empire's continued evolution as a multi-ethnic state that had to accommodate diverse spiritual traditions while maintaining ideological unity. The systematic integration of local deities into the imperial pantheon created religious frameworks that respected regional traditions, while reinforcing the central authority of the Hittite king as the supreme representative of divine power. The elaborate festival cycles that developed during this period created shared religious experiences that brought together populations from throughout the empire in celebrations that reinforced political loyalty and cultural identity. The development of new religious sites throughout the empire created networks of sacred places that served both spiritual and administrative functions within the imperial system. The rock sanctuary at Yazilikaya, with its elaborate relief carvings depicting the entire Hittite pantheon, represented the culmination of Hittite religious art and provided a sacred space for the most important ceremonies of the imperial court. The sanctuary's sophisticated iconographic program, which integrated deities from throughout the empire into a coherent theological system, demonstrated the religious synthesis that had enabled the Hittites to govern their diverse territories effectively. The golden age of Hittite prosperity that had flourished under the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty began to face unprecedented challenges as the 13th century BCE drew to a close. The empire that had once projected power from the Aegean to the Euphrates now confronted a convergence of threats that would test every aspect of the imperial system that had been carefully constructed over centuries of expansion and consolidation. The first ominous signs appeared in the eastern territories, where the resurgent Assyrian Empire under Tukulti-Ninurta first had begun to challenge Hittite control over the crucial trade routes and tributary states that connected Anatolia with Mesopotamia. Tukulti-Ninurta, the third succession to the Assyrian throne around 1243 BCE, had marked the beginning of a new phase of Mesopotamian expansion that directly threatened Hittite interests throughout the region. The Assyrian king's military campaigns demonstrated capabilities that surpassed those of his predecessors, combining traditional Mesopotamian siege warfare techniques with innovations in chariot tactics and infantry organization that proved devastatingly effective against the fortified cities of northern Mesopotamia. The systematic reduction of Mitanni successor states that had maintained nominal independence under Hittite protection revealed the extent to which the balance of power in the region had shifted during the previous decades of Hittite focus on Egyptian relations. The Assyrian advance into territories that the Hittites considered essential for their security created immediate strategic dilemmas for the imperial government at Hattusa. The loss of tribute from cities such as Carchemish and Tilbarsip represented not merely financial setbacks, but fundamental challenges to the empire's ability to maintain its extensive administrative apparatus and military forces. The Hittite response required the redeployment of resources from other regions and the mobilization of military units that had been stationed along the empire's other frontiers, creating vulnerabilities that would prove significant in the coming years. The military confrontations between Hittite and Assyrian forces in the borderlands of northern Syria revealed the extent to which Assyrian military capabilities had evolved during their period of expansion. The Assyrian army that Tukulti-Ninurta first deployed against Hittite positions included heavily armoured infantry units equipped with iron weapons that provided significant advantages in close combat. The Assyrian chariot forces, organised into larger formations than their Hittite counterparts, demonstrated tactical flexibility and coordination that enabled them to dominate the open terrain where much of the fighting occurred. The siege of Carchemish in 1225 BCE represented the most significant military challenge that the Hittite Empire had faced since the confrontation with Egypt at Kadesh. The city's massive fortifications, strengthened over decades of Hittite investment, had been designed to withstand prolonged siege, but Assyrian engineers employed innovative techniques that overcame even the most sophisticated defensive systems. The systematic undermining of wall sections, combined with the use of massive siege engines and coordinated assault formations, demonstrated military capabilities that forced Hittite commanders to reconsider their traditional approaches to fortress warfare. The fall of Carchemish after a siege lasting several months sent shockwaves throughout the Hittite Empire and marked the beginning of a period of territorial contraction that would continue for the remainder of the empire's existence. The city's capture provided the Assyrians with a crucial foothold in northern Syria and access to the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean coast with the Mesopotamian heartland. The loss of Carchemish's tribute revenues, combined with the costs of attempting to defend other threatened positions, created financial pressures that forced the Hittite government to make difficult choices about resource allocation and strategic priorities. The Assyrian expansion into Hittite territories coincided with the emergence of internal succession disputes that would prove even more damaging to imperial stability than external military threats. The death of Hattusili III around 1237 BCE had initially resulted in the smooth succession of his son Tudhaliya IV, but the new king's authority was almost immediately challenged by his cousin Kurunta, who claimed that his own father's earlier designation as heir had been illegally overturned. The resulting conflict between the two branches of the royal family created divisions within the Hittite nobility that undermined the empire's ability to respond effectively to external threats. Kurunta's challenge to Tudhaliya IV's legitimacy drew support from powerful noble families who had been excluded from positions of influence during Hattusili III's reign. The dispute involved complex legal arguments about the interpretation of succession laws and the validity of various royal decrees that had modified traditional inheritance procedures. The preservation of legal documents from both sides of the conflict in the Hattusa archives provides unprecedented insight into the constitutional crisis that paralysed the empire's decision-making apparatus during this crucial period. The civil war that erupted between supporters of the two rival claimants involved military forces drawn from throughout the empire and created conditions of instability that persisted for several years. Tudhaliya IV's control over the capital and the central administrative apparatus provided him with significant advantages, but Kurunta's support among provincial governors and military commanders enabled him to maintain effective resistance from strongholds in southern Anatolia. The conflict required both sides to divert resources from frontier defence to internal warfare, creating opportunities that external enemies were quick to exploit. The military operations conducted by both sides during this civil war demonstrated the extent to which Hittite military capabilities had been degraded by decades of external warfare and internal political instability. The armies that fought at battles such as the engagement near Hattusa in 1235 BCE consisted largely of hastily assembled militia units and foreign mercenaries, rather than the professional forces that had characterized earlier Hittite military operations. The tactical coordination and logistical support that had enabled previous Hittite successes were largely absent, replaced by opportunistic raids and sieges that devastated the empire's economic infrastructure. The resolution of the succession dispute in favour of Tudhaliya IV came only after extensive negotiations, mediated by senior religious officials and the intervention of Egyptian diplomats who recognised that continued Hittite instability threatened the regional balance of power that had been established by the peace treaty. The final agreement required significant concessions from both sides, including the recognition of Kurunta's authority over substantial territories in southern Anatolia and the redistribution of administrative positions among the noble families that had supported different claimants. The damage inflicted by this internal conflict extended far beyond the immediate military and political consequences to encompass fundamental weakening of the imperial system's institutional foundations. The authority of the central government had been severely compromised by the demonstration that royal succession could be successfully challenged through military force, creating precedents that would encourage future disputes. The loyalty of provincial governors and military commanders had been tested and found wanting, revealing the extent to which the empire's cohesion depended on personal relationships rather than institutional structures. The external threats that the Hittite Empire faced during this period of internal weakness were not limited to Assyrian expansion in the east. The first recorded appearances of the Sea Peoples in the eastern Mediterranean created new challenges that the empire was ill-equipped to address given its focus on internal conflicts and Assyrian pressure. The initial raids on Cyprus around 1230 BCE demonstrated the maritime capabilities of these mysterious peoples and their ability to strike at targets that had previously been secure from land-based attacks. The impact of Sea Peoples' raids on Hittite coastal territories extended beyond immediate military damage to encompass fundamental disruption of the trade networks that had sustained the empire's economy throughout its period of expansion. The attacks on ports such as Ura and Tarsus interrupted the flow of goods between Anatolia and the Levant, reducing customs revenues and creating shortages of luxury items that were essential for maintaining the loyalty of the nobility. The psychological impact of these raids was equally significant, as they demonstrated that the Hittite Empire could no longer guarantee the security of its territories against determined attackers. The Hittite naval response to the Sea Peoples' threat revealed the empire's limited capabilities in maritime warfare and the extent to which its military focus had been concentrated on land-based operations. The small fleet that the Hittites maintained for coastal defence proved inadequate to counter the larger and more manoeuvrable vessels employed by the Sea Peoples, whose naval tactics emphasised speed and surprise rather than the formal battle formations that characterise contemporary land warfare. The failure of Hittite naval forces to prevent continued raids created additional pressure on the empire's already strained resources. The disruption of Mediterranean trade networks by Sea Peoples' activities coincided with broader economic difficulties that reflected the empire's declining ability to maintain the tribute system that had sustained its administrative structure. The loss of control over key trade routes, combined with the costs of defending remaining territories against multiple threats, created a vicious cycle in which reduced revenues led to military weakness that resulted in further territorial losses. The detailed records maintained by royal scribes document the steady decline in tribute receipts from vassal states and the increasing difficulty of collecting taxes from populations that faced their own economic hardships. The agricultural crisis that affected much of the eastern Mediterranean during this period created additional pressures on the Hittite Empire's already strained resources. The evidence for widespread famine comes from multiple sources, including royal correspondence that documents requests for grain shipments from Egypt and administrative records that reveal the redistribution of stored supplies from royal granaries. The climate conditions that contributed to these agricultural failures appear to have been regional in scope, affecting not only Hittite territories but also the neighbouring kingdoms whose stability was essential for maintaining the empire's security. The population displacement that resulted from these combined pressures created additional administrative challenges for the Hittite government. The movement of refugees from threatened frontier regions into the empire's core territories placed strains on food supplies and housing that the central administration was increasingly unable to address effectively. The integration of displaced populations into existing communities created social tensions that undermined the stability of regions that had previously been secure from external threats. The breakdown of the tribute system that had provided the financial foundation for Hittite imperial administration represented perhaps the most serious long-term challenge facing the empire during this period. The system's effectiveness had depended on the empire's ability to provide security and economic benefits to vassal states in exchange for their tribute payments and military service. The empire's declining military capabilities and the increasing frequency of external attacks made it impossible to fulfill these obligations, leading to the gradual withdrawal of support from vassal rulers who had previously been reliable allies. The administrative correspondence from this period reveals the desperate measures that Hittite officials employed in attempts to maintain the loyalty of vassal states and preserve the empire's territorial integrity. The offers of reduced tribute obligations, military assistance, and other concessions demonstrate the extent to which the balance of power had shifted in favour of local rulers who could now negotiate from positions of strength. The gradual transformation of the tribute system from a mechanism of imperial control into a series of bilateral agreements between equals marked a fundamental change in the nature of Hittite authority. The military reforms that Tudhaliya IV attempted to implement in response to these multiple challenges revealed both the empire's remaining capabilities and the limitations that constrained its response to external threats. The reorganization of the army around smaller, more flexible units reflected lessons learned from confrontations with Assyrian forces and Sea Peoples raiders, but the reforms also acknowledged the empire's inability to maintain the large professional forces that had characterized earlier periods. The increased reliance on local militia units and foreign mercenaries represented practical adaptations to resource constraints rather than improvements in military effectiveness. The fortification programs initiated during this period demonstrated the empire's shift from offensive to defensive strategies, and the recognition that territorial expansion was no longer feasible given the empire's reduced capabilities. The strengthening of defences at key cities such as Hattusa and Alaka Hoyuk involved the construction of additional walls, the improvement of water supply systems, and the stockpiling of supplies that would enable prolonged resistance to siege. These measures reflected realistic assessments of the empire's strategic situation, but also represented acknowledgement that the initiative in regional conflicts had passed to the empire's enemies. The archaeological evidence from sites throughout the Hittite Empire reveals a pattern of systematic destruction and abandonment that began around 1200 BCE and accelerated rapidly in the following decades. The destruction layers at major urban centres such as Al-Alach Ugarit, and numerous smaller settlements in northern Syria contain evidence of intense burning, collapsed buildings, and the hasty abandonment of valuable objects that suggest sudden and overwhelming attacks. The ceramic assemblages from these destruction contexts indicate that the attacks occurred within a relatively short time frame, suggesting coordinated military operations rather than isolated raids. The massive invasion of the Sea Peoples that struck the eastern Mediterranean around 1180 BCE represented the culmination of decades of increasing pressure on the established political order. The scale of this movement distinguished it from earlier raids, as archaeological evidence indicates the simultaneous destruction of cities across a vast geographical area extending from the Aegean to the Levant. The attackers employed both land and sea forces in coordinated operations that overwhelmed the defensive capabilities of even the most heavily fortified settlements. The identity and origins of the Sea Peoples remain subjects of scholarly debate, but the archaeological evidence suggests they represented a confederation of different groups rather than a single unified people. The distinctive pottery styles, weapon types, and burial practices found at sites associated with Sea Peoples activities indicate cultural diversity that reflects the complex population movements occurring throughout the eastern Mediterranean during this period. The presence of Aegean-style pottery at destruction sites in Cyprus and the Levant suggests that some groups originated in the Greek world, while other material remains point to origins in western Anatolia and the Italian peninsula. The military tactics employed by the Sea Peoples differed significantly from those of the established Bronze Age kingdoms they confronted. Rather than relying on the formal battle formations and siege techniques that characterize contemporary warfare, the invaders employed rapid mobility, surprise attacks, and the systematic destruction of urban centres. The archaeological evidence from destroyed cities shows that the attackers made no attempt to occupy conquered territories, but instead focused on the complete elimination of existing political and economic structures. The destruction of Hattusa itself provides the most dramatic evidence for the collapse of Hittite imperial power. The archaeological excavations conducted at the site have revealed extensive burning throughout the upper city, with particular concentration in the royal palace complex and administrative buildings. The destruction layer contains numerous cuneiform tablets that were baked hard by the intense heat, preserving administrative records that document the empire's final years. The hasty abandonment of the city is evidenced by the discovery of valuable objects, including royal seals and precious metal artifacts left behind in the ruins. The royal citadel of Buyukale shows evidence of systematic destruction that suggests deliberate targeting of the symbols and infrastructure of Hittite royal power. The throne room, where generations of Hittite kings had received foreign ambassadors and conducted state ceremonies, was found filled with debris from collapsed walls and roofing materials. The royal archives, which had preserved the diplomatic correspondence and administrative records of the empire, were scattered and partially destroyed, though enough tablets survived to provide insight into the empire's final crisis. The water supply systems that had been carefully constructed to sustain the capital during sieges were deliberately damaged, with evidence of blocked channels and destroyed reservoirs that would have made the site uninhabitable for any surviving population. The massive fortification walls that had protected the city for centuries show signs of systematic dismantling, with sections of the defensive circuit torn down and the stones scattered. The destruction was so complete that the site was never reoccupied as a major urban centre, marking the definitive end of Hittite imperial power. The fate of the last Hittite kings remains shrouded in mystery, as no contemporary records document their final actions or ultimate destiny. Suppiluliuma II, who appears to have been the last ruler to exercise effective control over the empire, is mentioned in fragmentary texts that suggest he attempted to organise resistance against the invaders. The king's naval operations against Cyprus, documented in Hittite records, represent one of the few known attempts by the empire to project power beyond its immediate borders during this final period. The collapse of central government authority created conditions of chaos throughout the former Hittite territories, as local administrators and military commanders attempted to maintain order without imperial support. The provincial governors who had previously implemented royal policies found themselves isolated from the capital and forced to make independent decisions about the defence of their territories. Some attempted to organise local resistance against the invaders, while others appear to have abandoned their posts and fled to safer regions. The survival of Hittite royal family members and court officials in the southern territories of the empire is documented by later inscriptions and archaeological evidence from sites such as Carchemish and Ma'alatia. These surviving enclaves maintained elements of Hittite political and cultural traditions while adapting to the changed circumstances of the post-imperial period. The rulers of these successor states continued to use Hittite royal titles and employed the hieroglyphic script that had been developed during the imperial period, creating a bridge between the Bronze Age Empire and the Iron Age kingdoms that would emerge in the following centuries. The disintegration of the imperial administration had immediate consequences for the complex systems of tribute collection, military recruitment, and judicial administration that had governed the empire's diverse territories. The carefully maintained records that had enabled the central government to monitor conditions throughout the empire were lost or destroyed, eliminating the information networks that had been essential for effective governance. The standardized legal procedures that had provided consistency in the application of imperial law gave way to local variations that reflected the diverse cultural traditions of different regions. The economic collapse that accompanied the political disintegration of the empire created conditions of widespread hardship throughout the former Hittite territories. The trade networks that had connected Anatolia with Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean world were disrupted by the destruction of key commercial centres and the breakdown of the security systems that had protected merchant caravans. The loss of tribute revenues from vassal states, combined with the costs of defending remaining territories, created financial crises that made it impossible to maintain the administrative and military apparatus necessary for imperial governance. The broader context of Bronze Age collapse throughout the eastern Mediterranean reveals that the Hittite Empire's destruction was part of a systemic failure that affected virtually every major power in the region. The simultaneous collapse of the Mycenaean palaces in Greece, the destruction of Ugarit and other Levantine cities, and the severe weakening of Egyptian power in Asia created a domino effect that eliminated the international system that had governed relations between the great powers for centuries. The role of the Hittite Empire in this broader collapse extended beyond its function as one of the victims of the crisis to encompass its significance as a crucial component of the late Bronze Age world system. The empire's control over Anatolian metal resources, its position astride major trade routes, and its diplomatic relationships with other powers had made it an essential element in the economic and political networks that sustained Bronze Age civilization. The elimination of Hittite power created disruptions that reverberated throughout the region and contributed to the broader systemic failure. The environmental factors that may have contributed to the Bronze Age collapse include evidence for climate change, seismic activity, and agricultural failures that created conditions of instability throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The paleoclimatic data suggests that the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE witnessed significant changes in precipitation patterns and temperature that would have affected agricultural productivity and population sustainability. The Hittite Empire's location in the Anatolian highlands made it particularly vulnerable to these environmental changes, as the region's agricultural systems depended on carefully managed water resources and stable climatic conditions. The technological changes that accompanied the Bronze Age collapse, particularly the spread of iron metallurgy, created new military capabilities that may have contributed to the effectiveness of the Sea Peoples and other groups that challenged the established powers. The Hittites' early adoption of iron technology had initially provided them with military advantages, but the rapid spread of ironworking techniques eliminated these advantages and may have contributed to the empire's vulnerability to attack by groups equipped with iron weapons. The social and cultural transformations that occurred during the collapse period involved fundamental changes in settlement patterns, political organisation, and cultural practices that marked the end of the Bronze Age world system. The destruction of the palace-centred societies that had characterised the late Bronze Age led to the emergence of new forms of political organisation that emphasised local autonomy and cultural diversity, rather than the centralised imperial systems that had dominated the region for centuries. The catastrophic destruction of Hattusa and the collapse of centralised Hittite authority around 1178 BCE did not mark the complete disappearance of Hittite civilization from the ancient world. In the mountainous regions of southeastern Anatolia and the fertile river valleys of northern Syria, remnants of the imperial administration, displaced royal family members, and local governors who had maintained their positions during the final chaos began the process of establishing new political entities that would preserve essential elements of Hittite culture for nearly 5 centuries after the empire's fall. These Neo-Hittite successor states, as modern scholars term them, represented a remarkable example of cultural continuity in the face of political fragmentation, maintaining distinctive Hittite traditions while adapting to the dramatically changed circumstances of the early Iron Age. The Kingdom of Carchemish emerged as the most significant of these successor states, established by members of the Hittite royal family who had survived the empire's collapse and retained control over this strategically crucial city on the Euphrates River. The rulers of Carchemish continued to employ the title Great King and maintained the elaborate court ceremonies that had characterized imperial administration, though their actual authority extended over a much smaller territory than their imperial predecessors had controlled. The city's position at the intersection of major trade routes connecting Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia provided the economic foundation necessary to support a sophisticated court culture and maintain the administrative apparatus required for effective governance. The archaeological evidence from Carchemish reveals the remarkable continuity of Hittite artistic and architectural traditions in the post-imperial period. The massive stone reliefs that decorated the city's gates and public buildings employed the same iconographic conventions and stylistic techniques that had characterized imperial Hittite art, depicting rulers in traditional poses of divine authority and military triumph. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that accompanied these reliefs demonstrate the continued use of the Luwian hieroglyphic script that had been developed during the imperial period, though the language itself shows evolution toward forms that would eventually develop into the various Luwian dialects of the early Iron Age. The palace complex at Carchemish, extensively excavated by British archaeologists in the early 20th century, provides detailed evidence for the adaptation of imperial architectural traditions to the reduced circumstances of the successor states. The throne room, while smaller than its imperial predecessors, maintained the essential elements of Hittite royal architecture, including the raised dais for the king's throne, the elaborate column bases that supported the roof structure, and the carefully planned sightlines that emphasized the ruler's elevated status. The residential quarters of the palace complex reveal the continued importance of extended royal households and the maintenance of court positions that had characterized imperial administration. The Kingdom of Malatya, established in the mountainous region of eastern Anatolia, represents another significant example of Neo-Hittite political organization and cultural continuity. The rulers of this state, who claimed descent from the imperial Hittite royal family, maintained control over the copper-rich regions of the Anti-Taurus Mountains and used these resources to support elaborate building programs and artistic projects. The massive stone sculptures discovered at Malatya demonstrate the continued vitality of Hittite artistic traditions, though they also show clear influences from contemporary Assyrian and Syrian artistic styles that reflect the increased cultural exchange of the early Iron Age. The hieroglyphic inscriptions from Malatya provide crucial evidence for the evolution of Hittite political ideology in the post-imperial period. The royal titles employed by the rulers of Malatya combined traditional Hittite elements with new formulations that reflected the changed political circumstances of the Iron Age. The kings continued to claim divine sanction for their authority and maintained the elaborate religious festivals that had legitimized imperial rule, though these ceremonies were adapted to local conditions and incorporated elements from the religious traditions of surrounding populations. The smaller Neo-Hittite states that emerged throughout southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, including Gurgum, Kumur, and Tabal, demonstrate the widespread survival of Hittite political and cultural traditions in regions that had been integrated into the imperial system during the late Bronze Age. These states varied considerably in size and political organization, ranging from city-states that controlled only their immediate hinterlands to regional kingdoms that maintained authority over several urban centers and their surrounding territories. Despite their political fragmentation, these states shared common cultural characteristics that reflected their origins in the imperial Hittite tradition and their continued interaction with each other through trade, diplomatic relations, and occasional military cooperation. The preservation of Hittite religious traditions in the Neo-Hittite successor states provides particularly striking evidence for cultural continuity in the post-imperial period. The storm god Tahunza, who had been central to imperial Hittite royal ideology, continued to serve as the patron deity of many Neo-Hittite rulers, though his worship incorporated elements from local religious traditions and showed influences from the religious practices of neighbouring peoples. The elaborate rock reliefs at sites such as Ivritz and Karatepe depict Neo-Hittite kings in traditional poses of religious devotion, offering libations to deities who combine Hittite characteristics with attributes derived from Syrian and Mesopotamian religious traditions. The festival cycles that had played such an important role in imperial Hittite religious life were maintained in modified forms throughout the Neo-Hittite period. The seasonal celebrations that marked important agricultural events continued to provide opportunities for rulers to demonstrate their divine favour and their role as intermediaries between the gods and their subjects. These festivals involved processions to sacred sites, elaborate sacrificial ceremonies, and the distribution of food and gifts that reinforced the social bonds between rulers and their subjects, while maintaining the religious traditions that had legitimized Hittite authority for centuries. The hieroglyphic writing system that had been developed during the imperial period underwent significant evolution in the Neo-Hittite successor states, adapting to the linguistic changes that occurred as the various Anatolian languages developed in different directions during the early Iron Age. The inscriptions from this period show increasing diversity in orthographic conventions and linguistic features that reflect the political fragmentation of the former imperial territories. Despite these changes, the basic structure of the writing system remained consistent, enabling modern scholars to trace the development of Anatolian languages and reconstruct the political history of the successor states. The artistic traditions maintained in the Neo-Hittite states demonstrate remarkable continuity with imperial precedents, while also showing clear evidence of innovation and adaptation to changing cultural circumstances. The stone relief sculptures that decorated public buildings and religious sites employed traditional Hittite iconographic conventions, but incorporated new stylistic elements that reflected contact with contemporary Assyrian, Phoenician, and Greek artistic traditions. The synthesis of these diverse influences created distinctive regional styles that maintained recognizable Hittite characteristics while adapting to the cosmopolitan cultural environment of the early Iron Age. The gradual absorption of the Neo-Hittite successor states into the expanding Assyrian Empire during the 8th and 7th centuries BCE mark the final phase of independent Hittite political organization, though elements of Hittite culture continue to influence the development of Anatolian civilization throughout the Iron Age. The Assyrian conquest of Carchemish in 717 BCE eliminated the last major Neo-Hittite kingdom, but the cultural traditions that have been preserved in these successor states continue to influence the development of later Anatolian peoples, including the Lydians, Phrygians, and eventually the various Greek city-states that established themselves along the Anatolian coast. The rediscovery of Hittite civilization in modern times began with the recognition of hieroglyphic inscriptions at sites throughout Turkey and northern Syria during the 19th century. Early travellers and archaeologists, including Charles Texier, who first identified the ruins of Hattusa in 1834, recognized that these sites represented the remains of a previously unknown ancient civilization, though the identity of their builders remained mysterious for several decades. The distinctive architectural features and artistic styles evident at these sites clearly indicated a sophisticated urban culture, but the absence of recognizable historical references made it impossible to connect these ruins with any known ancient people. The breakthrough in understanding came with the discovery of the royal archives at Hattusa during German excavations that began in 1906 under the direction of Hugo Winkler. The thousands of cuneiform tablets found in the palace complex and administrative buildings provided the first direct evidence for the existence of the Hittite Empire and its role in ancient Near Eastern politics. The tablets included diplomatic correspondence with Egypt, Assyria, and other major powers that placed the Hittites firmly within the known historical framework of the Late Bronze Age. The discovery of the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty in both Egyptian and Hittite versions provided particularly dramatic confirmation of the empire's historical significance. The decipherment of the Hittite cuneiform script was accomplished by the Czech scholar Bedřich Hrozný, who published his initial results in 1915 and continued to refine his understanding of the language throughout the following decades. Hrozny's recognition that Hittite belonged to the Indo-European language family revolutionized understanding of both ancient Anatolian history and the broader development of Indo-European languages. His work demonstrated that Hittite preserved archaic features that provided crucial evidence for reconstructing the original Indo-European language and understanding the early stages of Indo-European expansion into Europe and Asia. The decipherment of the Luwian hieroglyphic script used in the Neo-Hittite inscriptions proved more challenging and was not fully accomplished until the mid-20th century through the combined efforts of scholars such as Ignace Gelb, Piero Marighi, and Emmanuel Laroche. The breakthrough came with the recognition that the script recorded a language closely related to Hittite, but with significant differences in vocabulary and grammar that reflected the evolution of Anatolian languages during the early Iron Age. The successful reading of these inscriptions provided crucial information about the Neo-Hittite successor states and their role in preserving Hittite cultural traditions. The archaeological investigation of Hittite sites has continued throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, with major excavations at Hattusa, Alaka Hoyuk, Kultepe, and numerous other sites providing increasingly detailed understanding of Hittite civilization. The work of archaeologists such as Kurt Bittel, Tahsin Ozguç, and Peter Neve has revealed the sophisticated urban planning, advanced metallurgical techniques, and complex administrative systems that characterized Hittite society. The discovery of intact royal tombs, administrative archives, and religious complexes has provided unprecedented insight into the daily life and cultural practices of the Hittite people. The lasting impact of Hittite civilization on subsequent cultures extends far beyond the direct influence of the Neo-Hittite successor states to encompass fundamental contributions to the development of law, diplomacy, metallurgy, and political organization throughout the ancient world. The Hittite legal codes, with their emphasis on compensation rather than punishment, and their recognition of individual rights and responsibilities, influenced the development of legal systems throughout the ancient Near East. The sophisticated treaty-making procedures developed by Hittite diplomats established precedents for international law that continued to influence diplomatic practice for centuries. The Hittite contributions to metallurgical technology, particularly their early adoption and development of ironworking techniques, had profound implications for the technological development of the ancient world. The superior weapons and tools produced by Hittite smiths provided military advantages that enabled the empire's expansion, while the eventual spread of these techniques contributed to the broader technological transformation that characterized the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. The Hittite expertise in mining, smelting, and metalworking influenced the development of these industries throughout Anatolia and provided the technological foundation for the later achievements of peoples such as the Lydians and Phrygians. The political innovations developed by the Hittite Empire, including the constitutional monarchy established by Telepinu's reforms and the sophisticated systems of provincial administration that governed the empire's diverse territories, provided models for political organization that influenced the development of later empires throughout the region. The Hittite approach to governing multi-ethnic populations through a combination of direct rule and vassal relationships established precedents that were adopted by subsequent empires, including the Assyrians, Persians, and eventually the Romans. The historical understanding of ancient Anatolia has been fundamentally transformed by the discovery and study of Hittite civilization. The recognition that this region was home to one of the ancient world's great empires has revealed the crucial role that Anatolia played in the development of Near Eastern civilization and the complex interactions between Europe, Asia, and Africa during the Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire's position at the crossroads of these three continents made it a crucial intermediary in the transmission of technologies, ideas, and cultural practices that shaped the development of civilization throughout the ancient world. The study of Hittite civilization continues to yield new insights into the nature of ancient empires, the development of Indo-European languages and cultures, and the complex processes of cultural transmission and adaptation that characterized the ancient world. The ongoing excavation of Hittite sites, the continued analysis of textual materials, and the application of new archaeological techniques promise to expand our understanding of this remarkable civilization and its lasting contributions to human history. The Hittites' legacy serves as a testament to the resilience of human culture and the enduring influence of political and technological innovations that transcend the boundaries of time and geography.